For over 4 decades, Israel and Iran have been locked in a simmering geopolitical rivalry defined by indirect confrontation, espionage, proxy wars, and clandestine operations. This shadow war has been played out largely in silence, through cyberattacks, assassinations, support for non-state actors, and covert military actions. But in 2024, the rules of engagement changed. A series of events from the October 7th Hamas-led attack on Israel to Iran's unprecedented missile assault on Israeli territory in April 2024 marked the unraveling of a long-maintained status quo. What had once been a conflict conducted in whispers and shadows erupted into a direct military exchange, breaking taboos, shifting red lines, and threatening to ignite a broader regional war. At the heart of this transformation is Syria, a once stable Arab republic now reduced to a battleground for regional hegemony. Leaked classified documents from the final months of Bashar al-Assad's regime reveal a covert deconfliction mechanism between Israel and Russia, designed to limit Israeli strikes and manage the delicate balance between Syria's security needs and Israel's red lines on Iranian entrenchment. These communications, sent by an Israeli operative codenamed Moses, expose Israel's tolerance for Assad, provided Iranian weapons and militias were kept at bay. But when that mechanism collapsed amid Assad's fall, so too did the illusion of stability. Iran, meanwhile, has escalated its strategy from quiet proxy support to open state aggression. Tehran's direct strike on Israeli soil on April 13, 2024, a barrage of over 300 drones and missiles, crossed a line not breached in decades. Israel's subsequent precision retaliation inside Iranian territory was equally unprecedented. This tit-for-tat culminated in a new phase of confrontation, one that defies the traditional limitations of hybrid warfare and now verges on outright interstate conflict. In today's video, we examine the shift from covert confrontation to open hostilities, analyzing the collapse of the shadow war, the strategic utility of Syria, the regional power dynamics that enabled this escalation, and the uncertain future of a Middle East on the brink. In this video, we trace how a decade-long Cold War is mutating into a hot one, and why, unless core political issues such as Gaza and Iranian-Israeli deterrence are addressed, this region may spiral into a far broader conflagration. The Israel-Iran rivalry did not begin with airstrikes or missile barrages. It began with the collapse of diplomacy and the rise of ideology. When Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution replaced the Shah's Western-aligned monarchy with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's theocratic regime, Tehran cut ties with Israel and adopted a fiercely anti-Zionist stance. What followed was not conventional warfare, but an enduring cold conflict, a shadow war conducted in the gray zones of espionage, terrorism, cyber warfare, and covert influence. For decades, both countries engaged each other not directly, but through proxies and deniable operations. Iran built a sprawling network known as the Axis of Resistance, consisting of militant groups ideologically aligned with Tehran's anti-Israel and anti-Western worldview. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Shia militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen all formed part of this constellation. Through funding, weapons transfer, training, and intelligence sharing, Iran extended its reach across the region, creating multiple fronts from which to pressure Israel and deter U.S. influence. Hezbollah emerged as Iran's crown jewel in this strategy. Since the 1980s, it has grown from a guerrilla group into a well-armed paramilitary force, with tens of thousands of rockets pointed at Israel's northern border. Tehran's support also turned southern Lebanon into a launchpad for continuous harassment of Israeli territory. Even more critically, Hezbollah became a deterrent should Israeli strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Hezbollah was positioned to retaliate, creating a mutually understood cost for escalation. On the Israeli side, the response was equally clandestine. Mossad, Israel's external intelligence agency, pursued a campaign of sabotage and assassination against Iranian scientists and facilities. Cyber attacks like the Stuxnet virus, widely attributed to Israeli-American collaboration, crippled Iran's nuclear centrifuges. Mossad is also believed to have orchestrated hits on senior Quds Force commanders and Hezbollah operatives across the region, often without public acknowledgement. This plausible deniability was a hallmark of the era. It allowed Israel to act without triggering open war and enabled Iran to deflect domestic pressures from direct retaliation. Syria played a critical role in this shadow conflict. After 2011, as Bashar al-Assad's regime became dependent on Iranian and Hezbollah support to survive the civil war, Syria turned into an Iranian weapons corridor and operational hub. Israeli jets routinely struck weapons depot, convoy, and military positions inside Syria, but with care not to topple Assad. The presence of Russian forces further complicated the battlefield, requiring Israel to coordinate indirectly with Moscow to avoid unintended clashes. For years, this uneasy triangle allowed Israel to manage its red lines while Iran expanded its regional footprint. The rationale behind these indirect engagements was strategic patience. Neither Israel nor Iran had the appetite for full-scale war. Instead, they sought to contain, deter, and degrade each other's capabilities through a balance of terror. Iran preferred asymmetric warfare and ideological export. Israel relied on technological superiority and surgical strikes. Each side believed it could erode the other's position over time without triggering uncontrollable escalation. The shadow war extended beyond military activity. In cyberspace, Iran and Israel clashed repeatedly, targeting each other's infrastructure, banks, and power grids. In intelligence circles, both nations infiltrated rival networks, ran double agents, and sowed discord through psychological operations. And in global diplomacy, they waged an influence battle, lobbying world powers, engaging in information warfare, and shaping narratives to win regional allies. Yet, by 2023, signs were emerging that this paradigm was fraying. Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas grew more emboldened, with increasingly open coordination. Israel's strikes in Syria became more frequent and bolder, and the balance of deterrence began to tilt. Hamas's October 7th assault, an operation believed to have received Iranian support, was the flashpoint that turned decades of proxy war into something much more dangerous. The old system of veiled confrontation had outlived its usefulness. Technology, ideology, and shifting regional alliances were converging to erode the barriers that once separated war from peace. The shadow war was slipping into the light. If Iran and Israel's shadow war had a center of gravity, it was Syria. Over the past decade, the war-torn country became both a battleground and a chessboard, a place where rival powers projected influence, managed crises, and fought proxy battles beneath the threshold of open war. At the core of this volatile equilibrium was a covert deconfliction mechanism overseen by Russia, designed to limit Israeli strikes in Syria and balance the interests of three unlikely stakeholders: Israel, Iran, and the Assad regime. A trove of leaked Syrian documents from 2023 revealed the inner workings of this shadowy arrangement. At its heart was an Israeli operative known only by the codename Moses, who directly messaged senior Syrian defense officials through encrypted platforms like WhatsApp. The messages, often stern and explicit, conveyed warnings about Iran-backed activities inside Syria, detailed Israeli intelligence on weapons transfers and personnel, and threatened consequences if red lines were crossed. The language was at once diplomatic and ominous, carefully crafted to deter Syrian cooperation with Hezbollah and Iran while maintaining the status quo with the Assad regime. The mechanism was simple if cynical. Israel tolerated the continued rule of Bashan al-Assad so long as his forces did not allow Syria to become a platform for Iranian military escalation. Israel's main concern was the transfer of advanced weaponry, precision-guided missiles, air defense systems, and drones to Hezbollah via Syria. Russia, which held significant leverage over Damascus due to its military support during the civil war, mediated between the sides to prevent full-scale confrontation. In this triangular arrangement, each actor had a role. Israel kept striking Iranian and Hezbollah-linked targets with relative impunity, so long as it avoided hitting core Syrian military infrastructure. Russia used its presence at airbases like Hamimim to monitor and sometimes shield sensitive operations. Assad, weakened by over a decade of war, played a delicate balancing act, appearing cooperative with Iran while trying not to provoke Israeli reprisals. But the documents reveal a far more fractured picture beneath the surface. While Damascus nominally controlled its territory, the reality was that Iran and Hezbollah operated independently within Syria, often without Assad's knowledge or consent. Iranian cargo planes landed at Russian-controlled air bases, offloading weapons bound for Hezbollah units near the Golan Heights. The Israelis knew this and meticulously tracked every flight, shipment, and militant movement. The Israeli messages, some of them were quoted verbatim in Syrian intelligence memos, read like a running commentary on Tehran's regional strategy. One message dated May 17, 2023, condemned rocket launches from Syrian territory during Quds Day events, identifying Hamas figures such as Khaled Mashal and Salah al-Aruri as orchestrators. It warned, if the person leading these is not clear to you, these elements are directed by Hamas. We demand you stop any Iranian preparations, as you're responsible for what is happening in Syria. A second message sent on May 29 listed precise Israeli strikes against a training camp in Dumair and Hezbollah-linked depots in Damascus, signaling both operational transparency and deterrence. The Israeli operative's tone grew sharper in subsequent messages. By June, Moses identified flights from Iran landing at Hamimim and Neirab airports, accused Syrian officials of facilitating Quds force transfers, and threatened further attacks unless those flights ceased. Yet one message on June 16th struck a different note, almost consolatory, acknowledging that certain cargo flights had stopped and calling it a positive step that will safeguard your interests. This mix of threats and reassurances reflected a deep Israeli understanding of Syria's fractured sovereignty. The messages not only pressured Damascus to rein in Iranian proxies, but subtly emphasized Syria's lack of control, driving a wedge between Assad and his patrons in Tehran. The deeper Israel penetrated Syria's security infrastructure, the more exposed and humiliated the Assad regime became. The Moses communiques were forwarded internally with urgency, always verbatim, as if Syrian officials feared being accused of collusion with the enemy. The regime's intelligence apparatus, once feared and opaque, was now reactive and fragmented, caught between Russian oversight, Iranian ambitions, and Israeli coercion. Complicating matters was the role of the so-called Golan File, a Hezbollah initiative designed to create attack cells near the Israeli-Syrian border. Spearheaded by senior commanders like Ali Musa Dakduk, who had previously orchestrated attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, the Golan File aimed to weaponize Syria's instability into a new front against Israel. These operatives recruited local Syrians, embedded weapons caches, and prepared for a time when Hezbollah could directly challenge Israel from the east. Israeli responses were swift and lethal. In November 2023, Dakduk was reportedly killed in an Israeli strike. The following month, another key operative, Mohammed al-Tamar, or Abu Julan, was eliminated in southern Syria. These strikes were more than tactical victories. They were strategic warnings that Israel would not allow the Golan Heights to become a second southern Lebanon. Despite the aggressiveness of Israel's approach, it maintained a deliberate restraint towards Syrian state forces, so long as Assad kept Iran in check. But that arrangement collapsed with Assad's unexpected fall in December 2023. Toppled not by Israeli strikes or Iranian machinations, but by Islamist rebels enabled by Turkish backing. The collapse of Damascus's control dissolved the entire deconfliction mechanism with Israel and Russia. Within hours of Assad's fall, Israel launched Operation Bashan Arrow, an unprecedented campaign of military strikes across Syrian territory. No longer constrained by the need to preserve Assad's rule, the Israeli military conducted 350 air and naval strikes, dismantling 70 to 80% of Syria's strategic military infrastructure. Key facilities linked to Syria's chemical weapons program were destroyed. The Syrian Air Force and Navy were rendered largely inoperative. What had once been a calculated surgical effort to enforce red lines had become a campaign of annihilation. The speed and intensity of Israel's offensive underscored a larger point. The shadow war was over, and the era of transactional diplomacy with Damascus had ended. Without Russia's oversight and with Assad gone, Israel had no reason to hold back. The vacuum left behind raised fears that Iran or extremist militias could surge into newly ungoverned spaces, a scenario Israel clearly intended to preempt through overwhelming force. The leaked documents and the collapse of the Russian-mediated mechanism exposed the core fragility of Syria's sovereignty. Assad's long-standing strategy of balancing between Iran, Russia, and Israel had failed. His regime, long hollowed out by war and dependency, could no longer control its territory, resist its patrons, or guarantee stability. What remained was a battlefield ripe for escalation. Former CIA officer David McCloskey summarized the tragedy succinctly. The documents offer an astounding glimpse into the extent to which Syria's weakened, hollowed regime had become a regional plaything. Assad had tried to play all sides, but by the end, he held no cards. In the broader arc of the Israel-Iran conflict, the fall of Assad marked the end of ambiguity. With Syria's collapse, the last buffers, geographic, diplomatic, and strategic, began to erode. Direct confrontation between Tehran and Jerusalem was no longer a distant possibility. It was fast becoming a reality. The foundations of Israel and Iran's decade-long shadow war were irreversibly shaken on October 7, 2023. On that day, Hamas, armed, trained, and ideologically supported by Iran, launched a surprise and unprecedented assault on Israeli civilians. The scale and brutality of the attack stunned the region. It was not merely a provocation, but an opening salvo in what would become the deadliest phase of Israeli-Iranian hostilities to date. What followed were cascading reverberations that unshackled the conflict from its covert restraints and pushed it into the open. The initial Hamas incursion led to the death of over 1,400 Israelis and the abduction of hundreds more, triggering Israel's most aggressive military response in decades. But beyond the immediate tragedy, the attack also obliterated a long-standing Israeli strategic assumption that deterrence through intelligence dominance, periodic military pressure, and containment of Iran's proxies could preserve security without provoking full-scale war. The next day, Hezbollah joined the fray. Launching salvos of rockets into northern Israel, the Lebanese militia signaled its alignment with the resistance axis and broadened the theater of confrontation. While Hezbollah strikes were limited in scope and largely symbolic at first, they demonstrated how Iran's network of proxies could act in concert when Tehran chose to escalate. For Iran, the October 7th attacks offered a unique geopolitical opportunity. The Islamic Republic had long used Hamas and Hezbollah to project power while avoiding direct confrontation. Now, Hamas attacks, coinciding with rising tensions over Israeli policies in the West Bank and Al-Aqsa Mosque, allowed Tehran to reassert its influence across the Arab world under the banner of Palestinian resistance. It also complicated the US-brokered normalization process between Israel and Gulf Arab states, particularly in Saudi Arabia, whose support for Israeli security was critical to the evolving regional order. The Israeli response, however, upended Iran's calculus. Israel launched a devastating ground and air campaign in Gaza, decimating Hamas's leadership and infrastructure. As the campaign wore on, reports surfaced of Israeli intelligence targeting Hamas operatives in Lebanon, Turkey, and even Iran. The message was clear: no safe haven existed for those responsible for October 7th. In parallel, Israel stepped up its operations in Syria. Precision airstrikes targeted Hezbollah weapons depots, Quds Force operatives, and infrastructure linked to the Golan File initiative. The intensity of these strikes revealed a strategic shift. The previous policy of avoiding Syrian regime targets had been discarded following Assad's fall. Without the Russian-mediated deconfliction mechanism, Israel no longer felt constrained. And yet, while Iran's proxies expanded their attacks, Houthis launched missiles from Yemen, Iraqi militias targeted US bases, and Hezbollah intensified pressure from Lebanon. Damascus remained conspicuously silent. Bashar al-Assad, who once touted himself as the fulcrum of the resistance axis, refrained from entering the fray. In a striking move, he even expelled the Houthis from the Yemeni embassy in Syria, signaling his desire to distance himself from Tehran's agenda. This detachment was no accident. Assad, newly weakened and isolated, sought to rebuild ties with Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. He hoped to rehabilitate his regime and secure reconstruction aid, objectives incompatible with being an Iranian pawn in a broader regional war. His silence during the Gaza conflict marked a turning point, a public break with Iran's revolutionary posture, and a clear pivot towards pragmatism. Tehran, however, was undeterred. Iran viewed Gaza not as a distraction but as a vital node in its long-term strategy to encircle Israel. The October 7th attacks served not just as a tactical purpose but a symbolic one, to show that resistance was alive and that Iran remained the central axis of that resistance. In this sense, the Gaza war acted as both a catalyst and a justification for Iran to escalate more openly. Meanwhile, in Israel, the political ramifications of October 7th were profound. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, already embattled over judicial reforms and widespread domestic protests, now faced a credibility crisis. The intelligence failure that allowed Hamas to breach Israeli borders raised questions about the competence of his national security apparatus and the wisdom of his regional policies. Under mounting pressure, Netanyahu doubled down on military action, not just in Gaza, but increasingly across Iranian assets throughout the Middle East. The shift was strategic but also emotional. For a nation reeling from the worst terror attack in its history, restraint was no longer an option. The public demanded retribution, and the government sought to re-establish deterrence not through whispers or covert assassinations, but with visible, overwhelming force. The era of ambiguity had ended. Thus, October 7th did not just mark a military escalation, it was a psychological rupture. It shattered the myth that Israel's adversaries could be managed solely through back-channel warnings, surgical strikes, or cyber warfare. It proved that Iran's proxy network was capable of triggering a regional conflagration, and that without direct deterrence, the shadow war would inevitably become a shooting war. This turning point also highlighted a deeper truth. The Israeli-Iranian conflict could no longer be compartmentalized into discrete arenas: Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq. The battlefields had become integrated. The fronts had merged, and in the absence of a reliable intermediary or a stable Syrian buffer, the Middle East was poised for a far more dangerous phase. By early 2024, the Middle East had entered a new and unstable phase. What had once been a carefully managed shadow war between Israel and Iran, contested through proxy cyberattacks and intelligence operations, had ruptured into a sequence of increasingly direct military actions. Two critical moments in April and October 2024 signaled that the veil of plausible deniability had lifted. What followed were state-to-state attacks, retaliation on sovereign soil, and the erosion of long-standing strategic taboos. The chain reaction began on April 1st, 2024, when Israel carried out a bold and provocative strike against an Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus. 12 individuals were killed, including 7 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force. Among them were senior commanders with deep ties to Hezbollah and Iran's regional operations. Though Israel did not formally claim responsibility, few doubted its involvement. The choice of target, a consulate building theoretically protected by diplomatic immunity, crossed a significant red line. Iran's leadership reacted with fury. The strike was interpreted not only as an attack on Iranian assets, but as an assault on its sovereignty and prestige. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who rarely comments directly on foreign military affairs, issued an unambiguous warning that retaliation would be swift and proportionate. The anticipation of Iran's response created a geopolitical tremor that stretched from Washington to Riyadh to Tel Aviv to Tehran. On April 13th, Iran delivered on its threat, launching an unprecedented multi-platform assault on Israeli territory. More than 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 120 ballistic missiles were fired at Israeli targets from 4 countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This was the first time in history that Iran had launched a direct strike on Israel from its own soil. Yet the attack failed in military terms. Israeli air defenses, augmented by US and allied systems, intercepted 99% of incoming projectiles. Only one Israeli citizen was injured and no significant infrastructure was damaged. But the implications of the assault went far beyond the physical effects. Iran had broken the last remaining barrier in its conflict with Israel, the taboo against direct state-on-state warfare. Strategically, Tehran's decision was more symbolic than tactical. It was designed to reassert deterrence after the Damascus consulate bombing, to demonstrate resolve to regional allies, and to project strength to domestic audience grappling with economic hardship and political repression. Iran's leaders were sending a calculated message. Further attacks on Iranian soil or interests would provoke increasingly forceful retaliation. Israel's next move was fraught with political and military complexity. Within the Israeli security establishment, voices diverged. Hawks urged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to seize the opportunity to deliver a devastating blow to Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure, targets long considered off-limits due to their potential to ignite regional war. Moderates, including many within the IDF and Israel's intelligence services, cautioned against triggering uncontrolled escalation. The United States, under President Joe Biden, forcefully advocated for restraint. Ultimately, Israel opted for a calibrated yet forceful response. In the early hours of April 20th, Israeli aircraft launched a series of precision strikes deep inside Iranian territory, targeting military bases and air defense installations. Notably, Israel avoided striking nuclear facilities or civilian infrastructure. The operation, carried out without U.S. assistance but with American foreknowledge, was designed to punish, not provoke. It was a strategic signal. Israel could strike inside Iran if necessary, but would hold back for now. These events, unfolding in rapid succession, altered the architecture of deterrence in the Middle East. The mutual ambiguity that once defined the Israel-Iran conflict had evaporated. Each state had now attacked the other's territory. Each had crossed red lines once thought sacrosanct. While the damage from these attacks was contained, the psychological consequences were immense. The October 2024 escalation built on these tensions. In the months following the April confrontation, two additional high-profile assassinations sent shockwaves through the region. The first occurred in July, when Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh was killed in a car bombing in Tehran. Though Israel did not take credit, few doubted its involvement. The second came in September, when Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah was killed in a precision drone strike in Beirut, again widely attributed to Israeli intelligence. Both attacks were deeply symbolic. Haniyeh's assassination, carried out while he was a guest of the Iranian government, was perceived in Tehran as a direct affront to Iranian sovereignty and honor. Nasrallah's killing, meanwhile, struck at the heart of Hezbollah's leadership and removed one of Iran's most trusted and long-standing proxies. Reports suggested that Khamenei was personally aggrieved by Nasrallah's death, with some in Iran's leadership calling for immediate retaliation. And so, on October 1st, Iran launched a second direct strike on Israel, larger in scale than April's, though similarly intercepted with minimal casualties. This time, the Israeli response was less restrained. Early on October 5th, Israeli warplanes carried out a three-wave assault on Iranian military targets, including facilities believed to house ballistic missile stockpiles. While civilian areas were avoided, some reports indicated collateral damage on the outskirts of Shiraz and Isfahan. This time, Israel made no effort to deny responsibility. The strikes were publicly acknowledged by Netanyahu's office, framed as a measured and necessary response to Iranian aggression. The Biden administration, desperate to avoid a regional conflagration weeks before the U.S. presidential election, reiterated calls for de-escalation but did not condemn Israel's actions outright. These tit-for-tat attacks revealed both the dangers and the limits of escalation. On the one hand, the direct confrontation between Israel and Iran had breached long-standing norms and could no longer be easily walked back. On the other hand, both states appeared to calibrate their responses carefully, avoiding mass casualties, nuclear infrastructure, or attacks on urban centers. Yet, the illusion of control was increasingly fragile. The Middle East had entered a period of strategic unpredictability. Each new strike invited retaliation, each retaliation raised the stakes, and unlike the Shadow War era, when distance deniability and intermediaries like Syria allowed for plausible restraint, direct attacks on homeland targets offered no such buffer. Moreover, the interconnectedness of the conflict zones meant that local skirmishes now risk triggering regional dominoes. A strike on an Iranian convoy in Iraq could spark Hezbollah action in Lebanon. A drone strike in Tehran might provoke missile fire from Yemen. The proxy network that had once insulated Tehran now served as a complex, combustible web, one that could ignite from multiple directions. In this new environment, Israel and Iran were no longer managing escalation, they were managing perception. Each sought to appear dominant without overreaching. Each tested red lines without erasing them entirely, but the margin for error was shrinking and the consequences of miscalculation were rising. The question looming over the region was no longer whether Israel and Iran would return to shadow war, it was whether that option still existed at all. As the Israel-Iran conflict transitioned from a murky shadow war to overt military engagements, both nations found themselves engaged in a delicate balancing act, exerting force without unleashing a region-wide war neither side could afford. Behind the missile strikes, drone attacks, and targeted assassinations was a game of strategic calculation, a contest of perception, deterrence, and restraint. At the center of that equation stood the United States, acting as both a buffer and pressure valve in a region increasingly on edge. From Israel's perspective, the stakes could not have been higher. The October 7, 2023 Hamas attack was not just a security failure, it was a national trauma. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, already under intense domestic scrutiny over his controversial judicial reforms and declining approval ratings, faced enormous pressure to restore a sense of control, deterrence, and security. The public wanted decisive action, not a return to ambiguous containment. Yet the Israeli leadership was acutely aware of its limitations. Despite its reputation for military superiority, Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF, are not designed for sustained long-range campaigns deep inside hostile territory. Its air force is world-class, and its intelligence services are among the most capable globally. But in terms of size, depth, and strategic endurance, Israel cannot match Iran, a much larger country with a population of nearly 90 million and a dispersed military-industrial complex. Moreover, Israel's proximity to other conflict zones meant its military resources were already stretched. The IDF was engaged in Gaza, monitoring escalating tensions in the West Bank and managing near-daily rocket fire from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Opening a full-scale war front against Iran risked overextension. Israeli planners knew that any prolonged campaign against Iran's infrastructure would require sustained logistical support, extensive aerial refueling, and perhaps even boots on the ground, scenarios that were unfeasible without robust American backing. On the Iranian side, the regime faced its own strategic constraints. Despite its aggressive posture and ideological rhetoric, Tehran has historically been careful to avoid direct confrontation with state adversaries. Iran's strength lies in asymmetric warfare, using proxies to maintain strategic depth, disrupt adversaries, and avoid direct attribution. The April and October 2024 strikes on Israel were dramatic departures from this model, likely driven more by a desire to reassert deterrence and satisfy domestic nationalist sentiment than to cause significant destruction. Domestically, Iran's leaders were still reeling from the aftermath of the 2022 to 2023 nationwide protests. The regime had weathered a storm of internal dissent, fueled by economic hardship, social repression, and discontent over corruption. In this context, projecting strength abroad became a means to reinforce legitimacy at home. Demonstrating a forceful response to Israeli provocations allowed Iran's leadership, particularly Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, to showcase resolve without undermining internal stability. Yet, Iran too had to tread carefully. The April 13 strike revealed both the power and the limitations of its missile arsenal. Despite launching hundreds of projectiles, Iranian forces failed to inflict meaningful damage on Israeli infrastructure, largely due to the effectiveness of Israel's multi-layered air defense systems, which include the Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow systems. The coordination with US, British, and French forces in intercepting the attacks further underscore Iran's isolation in a high-tech military confrontation. Here, the role of the United States was critical. Washington did not just assist Israel in defending against Iranian attacks, it shaped the conflict's trajectory behind the scenes. President Joe Biden, wary of regional escalation during a heated presidential campaign cycle, applied direct pressure on Netanyahu to avoid retaliating too forcefully. His administration's message was clear: defend but do not escalate. The US had strategic interests to protect. With American forces stationed across the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, an all-out war between Israel and Iran could expose US troops to attacks by Iranian-backed militias. Moreover, the US was trying to stabilize fragile diplomacy with Gulf Arab states and prevent the collapse of normalization efforts between Israel and Saudi Arabia. A regional war threatened all of that. To manage the crisis, Washington deployed hard and soft power. In addition to deploying naval assets to Eastern Mediterranean and Arabian Gulf, the US launched diplomatic missions across the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Tel Aviv, Amman, and Doha in quick succession. His goal was just not de-escalation, but containment, convincing Israel to show restraint while warning Iran that further retaliation would provoke a unified Western response. This American mediation was visible in the restraint shown by both sides after the October strikes. While Israel publicly claimed responsibility for its retaliation, it avoided targeting civilian centers or nuclear infrastructure. Iran in turn downplayed the damage and refrained from a third counterstrike, likely heeding Washington's warnings and calculating that it had made its point. But even as the US succeeded in lowering the temperature temporarily, its leverage was not absolute. Netanyahu, under pressure from hawkish elements within his government and security establishment, made it clear that further Iranian aggression would not go unanswered. His political survival, as well as Israel's strategic doctrine of deterrence through dominance, depended on responding to threats with overwhelming force. Similarly, within Iran, hardline factions in the Revolutionary Guard Corps and intelligence community viewed the April and October strikes not as ends, but as steps in a longer campaign to undermine Israel's regional alliances and erode its strategic confidence. For them, restraint was not weakness, but delay. The desire for revenge over the killings of leaders like Haniyeh and Nasrallah still simmered beneath the surface. This creates a dangerous paradox. Both Israel and Iran believe they are acting with restraint, even as their actions push the region closer to the brink. Each side believes the other understands its red lines. Each side assumes the other will calibrate its response. But in a region with so many fronts, proxies, and moving pieces, the risk of miscalculation is profound. At the heart of this dynamic is deterrence, not just military, but psychological. Iran wants to deter Israel from violating its sovereignty, assassinating its leaders, and threatening its regime's survival. But deterrence works only when communication is clear and the consequences are predictable. The events of 2024 have proven that those assumptions can no longer be trusted. In the end, the United States remains the most significant external factor capable of restraining both sides. But American influence is not infinite, and domestic political considerations on both sides of the Atlantic can erode Washington's ability to broker long-term stability. If the US falters or disengages, there is little to prevent the next round of escalation from spiraling into something far worse. Beneath the missile exchanges and geopolitical brinkmanship, the enduring heart of the Israel-Iran conflict remains unresolved: Gaza and the broader Palestinian question. It is this unresolved core, repeatedly overshadowed by proxy battles and superpower diplomacy, that continues to inflame passions across the Middle East and tether Iran's ideological legitimacy to the Palestinian cause. Gaza, long besieged and impoverished, has become both a symbol and a strategic asset in Iran's regional calculus. The enclave is governed by Hamas, a Sunni Islamist group that receives substantial financial, logistical, and strategic support from Tehran. While Iran's backing of Sunni movement might seem incongruous given its Shia identity, it is emblematic of a broader strategy, uniting disparate actors under the banner of anti-Zionism and resistance to Western influence. In supporting Hamas, Iran projects itself as the defender of Palestine, bolstering its ideological credentials at home and among Arab populations. The events of October 7, 2023 reinforce this dynamic. The attack carried out by Hamas, though militarily devastating for Israel, served Tehran's strategic objective: reigniting global focus on the Palestinian plight, undermining Israel's security doctrine, and forcing Tel Aviv into a sustained and bloody urban campaign in Gaza. The Iranian regime celebrated the attack as vindication of its decade-long support for the resistance. For Israel, Gaza has become both a security nightmare and a moral crucible. Following October 7th, the Israeli military undertook a comprehensive ground and air campaign to dismantle Hamas's infrastructure, assassinate its leadership, and restore deterrence. But the war came at a severe cost. Thousands of civilians were killed, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, and humanitarian conditions collapsed. The world watched in horror, with international condemnation mounting and even Israel's staunchest allies calling for restraint. Yet what remains absent in the aftermath of the Gaza conflict is a political solution. The destruction of Hamas's command structure did not eliminate the underlying grievances that fuel resistance: statelessness, displacement, economic despair, and the lack of a viable peace process. As long as Gaza remains an open wound, it will continue to serve as fertile ground for radicalization and external manipulation. Iran understands this and leverages it masterfully. In moments of crisis, whether during Israeli raids in the West Bank or during Ramadan tensions at Al-Aqsa Mosque, Iran and its allies amplify the Palestinian cause to galvanize support, justify regional interventions, and distract from domestic unrest. Gaza is more than just a battlefield, it's a narrative weapon. Meanwhile, Israel faces a dilemma. It seeks to neutralize security threats emanating from Gaza while simultaneously avoiding reoccupying the territory or being seen as responsible for its governance. The Palestinian Authority is too weak and discredited to step in, and international proposals for an Arab-led peacekeeping force have failed to materialize. This strategic vacuum ensures that Gaza remains ungoverned, unstable, and vulnerable to the same cycles of violence that have persisted for over a decade. The implications for the Israel-Iran conflict are clear. As long as Gaza remains unresolved, it will serve as a flashpoint, a trigger for proxy escalations, a rallying cry for Iranian intervention, and a thorn in Israel's security doctrine. Every rocket launched from the Strip or every Israeli airstrike on Hamas targets risk escalating into a broader regional crisis involving Hezbollah, the Houthis, or even direct Iranian action. In this sense, Gaza is not just a humanitarian crisis or a diplomatic failure, it is the linchpin in a wider geopolitical struggle. The continued marginalization of the Palestinian issue has turned into a destabilizing force with global ramifications. Until a political resolution is found, one that addresses the aspirations and grievances of Palestinians, any effort to de-escalate the Iran-Israel conflict will be partial at best and temporary at worst. The Israel-Iran conflict, once shrouded in ambiguity and conducted in the shadows of diplomacy and deniability, now stands exposed. This transformation from a proxy-driven indirect confrontation into open military hostilities has not only shattered long-standing norms, it has raised fundamental questions about the future of security, sovereignty, and stability in the Middle East. As both nations grapple with the consequences of their escalation, the region finds itself at a dangerous inflection point. Will this conflict spiral towards systemic collapse or settle into a new, more volatile equilibrium? The events of 2023 and 2024 have systematically dismantled the mechanisms that previously restrained escalation. The covert communications between Israel and the Assad regime, mediated by Russia and based on a shared interest in avoiding outright war, no longer exist. Assad's fall, and with it the collapse of the deconfliction arrangement, removed a key buffer between Israel and Iran's proxies operating in Syria. Russia, distracted and diplomatically diminished due to its war in Ukraine, has lost its capacity to moderate between Israel, Syria, and Iran. In their place is a strategic vacuum. Iran has grown more assertive, embracing open confrontation when it suits its needs. Its April and October 2024 attacks on Israeli territory broke with 4 decades of indirect engagement and showed that Tehran is willing to absorb the risks of direct retaliation if it serves a larger narrative or deterrence and resistance. At the same time, Israel has responded with growing boldness, abandoning ambiguity in favor of visible, targeted strikes deep inside Iranian territory and among its regional allies. What emerges is a fragile state of mutual deterrence, but one without the institutionalized communication channels or trusted intermediaries that such a system typically requires. Unlike the Cold War standoff between the US and Soviet Union, which was undergirded by treaties, back channels, and crisis hotlines, the Israel-Iran confrontation is ad hoc, emotionally charged, and deeply embedded in ideology. In such a system, miscalculations are not only possible, they are inevitable. The role of the United States in managing this conflict remains pivotal but precarious. While Washington succeeded in temporarily restraining both Israel and Iran after the April 2024 exchanges, its ability to exert long-term influence is constrained by domestic policies, alliance fatigue, and shifting global priorities. The Biden administration's attempt to revive diplomacy and prevent a regional war faced constant friction, not only from hardliners in Tehran and Jerusalem, but also from the broader strategic realignment in the Middle East. That realignment includes the growing normalization between Israel and Sunni Arab states, particularly those in the Gulf. While the Abraham Accords marked a seismic shift in regional diplomacy, the October 7 attacks and the ensuing war in Gaza have strained these emerging alliances. Public opinion in many Arab countries remains strongly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, creating political friction for leaders seeking closer ties with Israel. Iran, ever astute in reading the regional mood, exploits the dissonance to undermine normalization and position itself as the true defender of Palestinian rights. At the center of this strategic knot is Gaza. As discussed earlier, the failure to resolve the Palestinian issue continues to act as an accelerant in the Israel-Iran conflict. It provides Iran with ideological legitimacy and operational justification, while creating unending security dilemmas for Israel. So long as Gaza remains a humanitarian catastrophe and political vacuum, it will serve as both a battleground and a propaganda tool in the broader conflict. To close off today's video, looking ahead, 3 scenarios present themselves, none of them ideal. The first is managed confrontation. Israel and Iran could return to a state of semi-containment with occasional direct strikes but a shared understanding to avoid full-scale war. This would require both sides to rebuild informal red lines and perhaps reinstate limited back channels, possibly with mediation from powers like US, Qatar, or Turkey. While this scenario maintains the current balance of terror, it is inherently unstable. The second scenario is uncontrolled escalation. A future miscalculation, perhaps an Israeli strike that kills a senior Iranian leader or a surprise attack by a proxy group, could tip the conflict into a full-blown war involving multiple fronts: Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and possibly the Arabian Peninsula. Such a war would be catastrophic in human, economic, and geopolitical terms and could draw in the US, Russia, and European powers. The third is systemic recalibration. This scenario would require bold diplomacy, perhaps a renewed push for a regional security architecture that includes non-aggression pacts, arms control agreements, and a credible process for resolving the Palestinian issue. While this is the most desirable outcome, it is the least likely in the current climate. The political will for compromise is absent, and the prevailing logic among decision makers is still dominated by force and deterrence. In the final analysis, the death of the shadow war is both symbolic and substantive. The region has moved beyond veiled threats and deniable operations into a period where national militaries strike each other across borders and where ambiguity has given way to explicit hostility. What is emerging is not peace nor even sustainable deterrence, but a new form of warfare, open, multidimensional, and psychologically uncontained. For Israel and Iran, the path forward is littered with risk, but also with opportunity. The coming months will test whether the two adversaries can recalibrate their strategies to avoid catastrophe, or whether, in chasing dominance, they plunge the Middle East into a war from which neither side can emerge whole. Thank you for your time in today's video. Please like and subscribe for more great content. Thanks.